All right, everyone. This is going to be our third recording on the United States Congress. So when we've looked over Congress, we've talked about the power of the incumbent. We've also covered the importance of leadership. Now let's focus on the power of representation. So we're looking at overall congressional power, in particular, what some individuals can do in the roles that they have, the representation that they have. So first, let's look here at whips, the power to enforce party discipline. So they represent their parties within Congress and try to get other members of Congress to do what they would want them to do. That's power, as we've covered going back to chapter 1, and some version of power. So let's say that the whip is trying to encourage another member of the whip's party to vote the party way. And this individual is not really supportive of going that direction. And so now a negotiation may take place. And so what the whip can do is has several different strategies to follow. So for example, as you can see here, the whip, and you can see it can either be a positive approach or a negative approach. So let's say the other member of Congress has a particular bill that that member would want to see voted on and, of course, hopefully passed. So you can see here that what the whip could do is either vote or not vote for a colleague's bill. So not even schedule it, really. And that would be the negative approach. Positive approach is to say, if you vote for this bill, then we will put your bill on the agenda. We will be voting on it. Now, your text refers to that as log rolling. One person votes for another colleague's bill. Now, in some ways, we can perhaps view that to be a corrupt form of behavior, but I would think all of us, to some degree, do favors to help out other people. And this is another way of looking at that when you view the behavior of Congress. Notice also, though, we've talked about the importance of standing committees, and that some standing committees would certainly be have a greater level of attraction to certain members of Congress, depending on their districts. And so here, again, positive, negative approach could appoint this reluctant member of Congress to a particular standing committee or not appoint them. So again, some of the power of the whip. And the whip would not be doing this entirely on his or her own accord, right? Would be acting with the majority or minority leader, depending on the party, or even the Speaker of the House. And support, not support re-election effort. That's really kind of the nuclear route to go, and in most cases probably would not be followed. But it's possible that they would go so far as to say, we're going to try to find an opponent to run against you in the primary. That's actually becoming a verb nowadays, to be primaried. And so you have that kind of activity there. So those are the strategies then that the whips can take to try to get people to vote a certain way. So here we have another way of looking at representation, and this is the case of the representatives facing his or her constituents, trying to deal with the constituents. So you have on page 471, you have sociological representation. And so a representative should be like the constituents. And so how representative should the representative be, right? Should it be based on the age comparable to the people in that district, the ethnicity comparable to the people in that district, the income comparable to the people in that district. And as your text points out, we don't really see too much sociological representation. Agency, the constituents have the power to replace the representative. So the representative should, in a way, always be perhaps looking over his shoulder, her shoulder, to try to say, you know, what do the constituents want? And I need to always keep that into consideration. But again, in this discussion here throughout this text and our other recordings, we've considered, are there really competitive districts and the possibility of an incumbent losing? In most situations, doesn't seem to be that way. Now, maybe it's because when it comes to representation, so many members of Congress are just very good at representing their constituents. They appear to be like their constituents. And this is an observation made by one of the better known and one of the best writers about Congress, an individual named Richard Fenno. And he coined this term home style. So representatives would know how to relate to their constituents. And maybe in many ways that we may not necessarily always be able to focus on, but it would be something that we would in a way absorb. Even how they would dress, what words they would use, what hobbies they would have, just their overall outlook, what cars they might drive. All these things would try to be in a way to fit in with their constituents. So in a way, you can think about that. Someone who perhaps has had a job and an income that really separates them from the rural part of the district that they're representing. And yet, you know, they drive a pickup, they wear blue jeans, and talk about hunting. And maybe they do all those things, but in many ways, they're not quite that individual, right? But they want to certainly appear to be that way. So that's an important part of representation. Now you can also see on page 471 when it comes to representation is how they would represent. So we just looked at in many ways style and the physical presence. And here we're looking at when it comes down to voting within Congress, what matters the most. So should they vote according to constituency? That's the delegate on page 470. Or should they vote according to his or her own beliefs? So what kind of representation do you expect? Would you want a representative that goes to Congress and that representative in a way looks it over and says, hey, 70% of the people in my district, based on public opinion polls, phone calls, however way you want to measure it, want me to vote a certain way, I'm going to vote that way? Or do you want a representative that looks over the information, and despite the numbers that are coming from the constituency, that individual says, this is my belief, and this is how I'm going to vote, even if it's not the way my constituents would want me to vote. So that leads us to a question for chat. What type of representation, delegate or trustee, do you believe is best? So again, think about how we just described them, how that's in your text, the delegate or trustee. Provide some input here. Which one would you want to have? A delegate type of representation or a trustee type of representation? We'll pause here and get some input going. So there's also power in lawmaking. So once you go through the lawmaking process, and so certainly review in this chapter all the discussions about the lawmaking process. So you can see that there are positions of authority and power along the way. For example, the representatives who are chairing the committees, and of course this is part of the Senate as well. So these different committee chairs have that initial power in the lawmaking process to get a bill out of committee. And so if a bill is on a particular issue, it would go to a certain committee, and that committee would come up with the precise language of the bill. That's referred to as the markup. So how that bill is going to be written and described to the other members of Congress, there's where you can see the power of the committee, and certainly the power of the chair to run that whole process, organize that process. Then once a bill has passed both the House and the Senate, you have two separate bills. So now there has to be one bill to be voted on. And so here we can see the power of the conference committee. And members of the House and the Senate, the House and the Senate will work out this compromise. So once again, the people who are on the conference committee would have considerable amount of power here. And that wouldn't be all members of Congress. So you can see here within Congress who has particular levels of power, the people who are serving as chairs, the people who get to represent their parties and their institutions in the conference committee. And there's also power in numbers. And so we've talked about this in some other capacities. So you have redistricting, if you notice here, and this is a census year, 2020. So redistricting will be occurring after this year. The process of redrawing election districts and redistributing legislative representatives. So that whole process there, where do these representatives go? And again, if we keep the same number of representatives, and we'll be talking about that here shortly, there you can see that some of those numbers will be shifting from one state to the next. And you also have gerrymandering, the apportionment of voters in districts in such a way as to give unfair advantage to one racial or ethnic group or political party. And we've talked about gerrymandering as well. And certainly there could be the possibility of gerrymandering in this redistricting process. And this is really a rhetorical question, but it is one to think about. Should voters choose representatives, or should representatives choose voters? I'm assuming everyone here believes that the voters should choose the representatives. But if you are able to get away with gerrymandering, then it's possible it's the representatives choosing the voters the way the districts are drawn. Increasingly, it would be that way. So the power in numbers, redistricting and gerrymandering. And then consider the numbers represented. So again, if we go back to the House of Representatives, we're looking at 435 representatives. Again, as we talked about before, that's been around now for over 90 years. So we've had this for quite some time. And the population of the United States has certainly increased since that time. So there are now 700,000 people roughly in that area, 700,000 people that are in each congressional district, each district in the House of Representatives. And that's more people than what's found in the Kansas City metro area. So it's in a way looking at a representative as a mayor, and consider how many people might be working for a mayor in a city the size of Kansas City. So that leads us to another question for chat. Should the number of representatives increase? Should we increase that number from 435? If we got it up to over 800, we would have then perhaps a reduction by close to half in that 700,000. And maybe you would have now people representing only 400,000 or so. So is that a benefit? Should we go that direction? So share your ideas on chat. All right, that's the last of our 3 presentations on Congress. A lot to say about Congress. There's still quite a bit there in that chapter, so make sure that you read through the chapter. We'll now move on and cover the presidency in our next recording.